Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to this session on advancing the race to net zero, how trade policy can support climate action. I'd like to start with a quote from Sir David Attenborough, one of the UK's national treasures. He said that we, the human species, are the greatest problem solvers on Earth. We invent vaccines quickly and we can solve the climate crisis. This panel is a panel of hope. It's about how trade policy can support much needed climate action and can contribute to mitigating world inequality. This is a co-organized panel between myself, representing the University of Sussex, the German Development Institute, and the UN Economic Commission for Europe. We were put together by IISD, thank you to the hub organizers, because our proposed panel had similar themes, which demonstrates how much brain power at the moment is thinking about this particular issue. In this panel, each of our speakers is going to be sharing their ideas and information about what their institutions and governments are doing in the area of trade policy to support climate action or helping addressing inequality. In that way, it's a panel of hope, showcasing human ingenuity to bring solutions towards sustainability. I won't be introducing the speakers in detail. This is done in the chat and you have their bios on the website. I'll be asking 2 or 3 questions to each of the speakers and they will have 8 minutes to respond, which allows us some time for questions at the end. So please do prepare your questions either in the chat or get ready to put up your virtual hand at the appropriate moment. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Ana Lizano, from the mission of Costa Rica to the WTO. Anna, can you tell us a bit about what the WTO itself can do towards linking trade and climate? Particularly, what will be the perspective of developing countries as we need to put these first in addressing solutions to the climate crisis, and how promising might be negotiations for the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability? Anna, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this kind invitation and always very nice to see familiar faces. Thank you, Teresa, for giving me the floor. I would like to address your question in a kind of broad way. First, the WTO's contribution to trade and climate is very timely, especially after COP26 and the impending need to link the trade and the climate or environmental agendas. The WTO certainly has a big contribution to make, and our view is that we need to first have specifically collaboration and cooperation. It is necessary, especially for members who depend on international trade, who are most likely going to be impacted by climate shocks, and therefore they depend on international policies and measures that may carry environmental or sustainability impacts as well. Another aspect is the use of platforms to facilitate dialogues. And the WTO is contributing through its members with platforms such as the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions that Canada and Costa Rica co-chair. And this is an opportunity to facilitate mechanisms of dialogue among policymakers and policy takers to reflect the realities that developing members and LDCs in particular have. And this is an opportunity for these members to share their experiences. For example, we know that developing and LDC members have a lot of experience in creating nature-based solutions, sustainable management of natural resources and environmental services. So this is a window for them to portray all these experiences. Many answers, we believe, come from the developing world. So this is a great opportunity that we are encouraging members to consider. Also, we think that it's important to build a cooperative international agenda. And that is why it's important to bring together trade and environmental ministers to the conversations. TESD, or the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, try to bring these two agendas together, because trade and the environment should not be seen disconnected from each other. Another important aspect on your question is how the structured discussions can help the WTO in this engagement, bringing together both the trade and climate, bring a contribution between trade and climate. So there's a very important aspect on the latest events that have put into perspective how fragile we are, the fragility of our dependence, not only to natural resources, but also to biodiversity. And we now know how climate shocks disrupt not only the way that we live, but also, especially for our purposes, the way we trade. And the impact of climate change in the trade, from the trade view, from the trade lens, impact supply chain, supply of essential goods, logistics, agriculture and food, and crop security. So as policymakers, we believe that there's a need for us to address the ways in which trade can enhance mitigation and enable adaptation to these climate shocks. There's also an opportunity for multilateral trade policy actions to support economic recovery, lift incomes, incentivize investment, but also support the global climate agenda and the sustainable development goals that have been the backbone of the structured discussions. So now, in the midst of this health crisis that even brought us to postpone the ministerial conference, the WTO must be ready to deliver concrete proposals for addressing climate change and other global environmental challenges through trade policies at the multilateral level. The structured discussions precisely want to be this platform of exchange and debates where we can reflect the experiences and realities of the members and encourage developing and least developed members to play a primary role in the conversation. Till this day, we have brought together 70 co-sponsors. Half of them are LDCs or developing countries. So we are walking the talk, making the structured discussions inclusive, open, and we have broad coverage through all the regions. We are now covering 80% of the world's trade with our co-sponsors. And I think it's very important also to acknowledge that although the ministerial conference has been postponed, the work of the structured discussions is not done. We are still ongoing. We are still gathering new co-sponsors. The work is there and we will not stop because our ministerial statement has been agreed by the ministers of these 70 members. It gives us the way for our work program. It opens the space for us to start working early next year. And that is our intention, to bring together as many co-sponsors as possible to encourage, to enrich the conversation among the members and hopefully try to consolidate this linkage between trade and the climate agendas. Thank you very much, Teresa.
Thank you, Anna. That was absolutely brilliant and concise. You have told us what the WTO is doing and that the work is ongoing. And I like how you highlighted the fragility of our interdependence and what the WTO can be doing about that. I'm now going to turn to our next speaker, who is Clara from the German Development Institute. Clara, I'd like to ask you to focus on two things roughly. Since progress at the multilateral level is slow, what is the potential of preferential trade agreements and how can these be leveraged? I know that you've been doing a lot of work on that. What can we learn from the existing agreements and to promoting climate action? And the second area is to look at how trade measures can help with implementing the NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Clara, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you very much. And I did bring some slides. Yeah, so here we go. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Anna for outlining the progress that's been made on trade and the environment in the WTO. And I think that's very promising and very encouraging, because as it looks like this new agenda is really trying to be both ambitious and inclusive. And that's, and really bringing forward trade and environment issues in the WTO in this sense is a very new, very new and promising process. I will focus more closely on tackling the intersection of trade and climate policies. And I think this is really central to preventing dangerous climate change and achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Recent research underlines the impact of trade policy on climate change. Again and again. For example, a recent study by Shapiro finds that trade policy creates a global implicit subsidy for CO2 emissions in internationally traded goods. And these implicit subsidies amount to several $100 billion annually. So there is a lot of scope and hope to tackle better the intersection of trade and climate. Today, I will briefly speak about 3 potential entry points for linking trade and climate. And this is on the next slide. Firstly, using climate provisions in preferential trade agreements to leverage climate actions. Secondly, using trade provisions in national climate plans in the context of the Paris Agreement. And thirdly, briefly, the idea of climate clubs. So moving on to the next slide. Yeah, this is perfect. So an ambitious multilateral agreement on climate and trade in the WTO is to many a first best option. An agreement that would include the liberalization of climate-friendly goods and services and the reform of fossil fuel subsidies could contribute considerably to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it is difficult for all WTO members to agree on this. And so I think we should all be open to discussing options that do not have to encompass all WTO members. And in light of time running out very quickly, we need to urgently focus, I think, on other solutions, namely using preferential trade agreements to also leverage climate actions. The good news is that trade agreements have the potential to complement multilateral climate governance. And in contrast to the consensus-seeking process under the umbrella of the UN or the WTO, trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, PTAs, bring together a limited number of partners who might have more leeway to explore new solutions to pursue trade and climate objectives simultaneously and in mutually beneficial ways. This, I think, can foster regulatory innovation and the elaboration of new commitments. And in fact, as we see here on the slide, trade agreements include ever more environmental provisions. This is what Trend shows, the trade and environment data, with data collected by Jean-Frédéric Morin and his team we're working with. And multiple trade agreements already include provisions that directly address climate change. And we can move on to the next slide. These climate-related provisions often address renewable energy or energy efficiency. Some trade agreements also directly address climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. However, despite its great potential, the contribution of trade agreements, of PTAs, to climate governance, I think, remains underexplored. So there's a substantial potential that still remains to be untapped. More concretely, what can be done, for example, an easily achievable aim might be enhanced liberalization for climate-related goods and services. And this is clearly a win-win solution, as it would contribute simultaneously to trade liberalization and fighting climate change at the same time. Yet even this relatively uncontroversial issue remains mostly ignored by the most recent trade negotiations and agreements. Another interesting example is the EU, which demands not only the ratification, but also the implementation of the Paris Agreement to complete a new trade agreement. More recent PTAs show some more progress and even include some mini climate chapters with several provisions that link to climate change. So this is a new development that's very interesting. For example, the very recent partnerships and treaties by the UK and Northern Ireland with Georgia, Norway, Liechtenstein, and the EU include a whole array of links to climate change. Next slide, please. Turning to the second entry point. A complementary option to using climate provisions in trade agreements is to make better use of national climate plans under the Paris Agreement, NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and to include trade provisions in these climate plans. Countries already mention trade in their NDCs, and a content analysis undertaken by myself shows that around 45% of all NDCs under the Paris Agreement contain some trade-related provisions. Yet only 22% include trade provisions that more specifically strengthen climate mitigation or adaptation. For example, by committing to the reduction of trade barriers for climate-related goods and services. So I think, again, there is considerable untapped potential and potential that needs to be better leveraged. Moving on to the next slide, and last but not least, let me mention another option, for example, proposed by Nobel laureate Nordhaus, climate clubs. The idea is to use trade measures as incentives to participate in climate clubs. So coalitions of nations that commit to strong steps to reducing emissions and mechanisms to penalize countries that do not participate on the basis of trade rules. Our latest research suggests that this is promising. We have analyzed more than 2,000 international environmental agreements, very many of which include different types of trade provisions. And we find that specifically trade liberalizing provisions in these environmental agreements can in fact increase trade flows among members, thus providing a club good to them. Such trade-based clubs can be a good way to create incentives to join these environmental agreements, potentially making them more ambitious, thereby increasing their potential to be effective. So this, I think, this recent research shows that climate clubs might indeed be a promising way forward. And it looks like there's also more political action beyond these ideas, looking at COP26 negotiations in Glasgow, looking at the new German government and the G7 presidency coming up. I think we'll see more of this coming up next year. So overall, climate and trade agreements, trade and climate agreements, and the idea of climate clubs, I think, offer promising entry points for linking trade and climate. And that should also be discussed in the context of building back better from the COVID-19 crisis. So last slide, please, next slide and last slide. So let's turn to the takeaways and the way forward. Yeah, I think we need more reflection on the role of trade provisions in climate and environmental agreements and in the NDCs. And we also need more reflection of making use of environmental provisions and climate provisions in PTAs. And to promote this work with other colleagues, including Howard van Asselt and Jean-Frédéric Morin and others, we plan to start a project to invest time in developing substantive and procedural options for existing PTAs and new negotiations to promote a development-oriented economic transition that is aligned with climate change goals. So we hope to be able to work on this more in the coming month. And last but not least, going forward, I think a trade ministers coalition for cooperation on climate action, as proposed by Caroline Dio-Bergbeck, director of TESS, would be a really promising way forward. At the international level, as we know, there is no official climate and trade agenda, neither at the WTO nor in the UNFCCC. And although the launch that Anna referred to, the launch of the TSD at the WTO does offer the potential for much needed multilateral dialogue on climate and trade, there is still no clear anchor for ministerial level diplomacy and for ministerial level coordination on climate trade intersections. So looking ahead, I think a trade ministers coalition could strengthen international dialogue and coordination on strategies, options, and best practices for aligning climate and trade policies better. Thank you very much for your attention. And over to you, Teresa.
Thank you, Clara, for a superbly clear expose of what's going on in preferential trade agreements in this area, on the links between trade and NDCs, and on climate clubs and IEAs. Thank you very much, and again, superbly timely. I'm now going to turn to our third speaker, which is Lucien Cernat from the European Commission, who, needless to say, is speaking in a personal capacity as ever. Lucien, you have some concerns about climate change exacerbating inequality and the extent to which international trade policy might be able to help mitigate the impact of the climate crisis on inequality. And specifically, you've been working on some innovative ideas to facilitate least developed countries in integrating into international trade. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please? Lucien, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and many thanks to my co-panelists for setting the ground so clearly and putting forward so many potential positive contributions that trade policy can bring to this multifaceted trade, climate change, development, income disparities. One thing I'd like to say from the outset, apart from the disclaimer that I am here in my personal capacity, is I think another important point I'd like to focus is the many things that multilateral partners need to put together in order for us to move the needle on all these aspects. So we know now that multilateralism is important. The WTO has a major contribution to provide, but that alone is not a silver bullet. We have the free trade agreements, many of which are signed by the European Union. We got this world champion medal from the WTO as being the signatory of the largest number of free trade agreements with valuable partners. And I think Clara's figures would probably indicate that we have a very strong commitment to putting environmental provisions in those free trade agreements. So there is a lot going on, also bridging creating synergies between various policies, since trade policy doesn't work in isolation. We've heard references to all these global climate commitments and how trade policy could connect to those initiatives. We also have very important sustainable development policies. Just the other day, for instance, the European Commission has announced a 300 billion global gateway program, the new European strategy to support partner countries on a number of common challenges, and that includes sustainable development, climate, green and clean infrastructure. So there is a lot of potential for us to work together with partners around the world. However, in this complex and challenging global environment, I think there is one element that deserves our full attention, and these are the least developed countries, the countries that face the biggest challenges from a development perspective. And this has been a historical challenge. The least developed country group has been created by the United Nations in 1971. And since then, many efforts and many initiatives were put together by the development community, by UN members, to facilitate the integration of LDC in the global trading system. Unfortunately, despite all these trade initiatives, including, for instance, the well-known everything but arms, the duty-free, quota-free type of measures that the European Union and many other WTO members offered to LDCs for their direct exports. Despite all these efforts, one of the important UN Sustainable Development Goal, which was to double the integration of LDCs in global supply chains and in world trade, has been elusive. The share of LDCs in global trade has been more or less around 1% for the last decade. COVID seems to be extremely challenging for the LDCs, being perhaps the second most affected group of countries. According to UNCTAD, the LDCs will face perhaps the worst crisis in the last 30 years in terms of increasing extreme poverty. Climate change will add to it. Many of these countries are extremely vulnerable when it comes to unintended consequences from climate in terms of changes that will make their livelihoods more difficult to sustain. So then the question is really in a very small, I would say, in a small proportion, and in all this big set of things we could do, is there anything that trade policymakers could offer to LDCs, knowing that, as I said, many schemes are already in place? And here comes this idea that has been also recently supported by a large number of academics and trade experts. I think a group of academics have written an open letter to the WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi, indicating that this is something that would require attention in the multilateral discussion. So the idea is very simple, and I will take a few minutes to explain it. It's simply a proposal to allow the integration of LDC value added of their exports along the supply chain. So far, all the trade policy initiatives would only promote LDC exports to one particular country, so direct exports. But let's take a very simple example, let's say coffee beans. So if you have duty-free access to any market that would offer such schemes for coffee beans from LDCs, that doesn't mean that if you produce a processed agri-food, sort of more sophisticated drink that involves these coffee beans from an LDC, that product that beverage, if you export it along the supply chains, it will face tariffs. And incidentally, on agri-food products, tariffs, MFN tariffs are double digits. So the benefits that we offer so far to coffee beans from LDCs would stop at the first border that they have to cross. That's why their participation in LDCs, in GVCs, in global supply chains of LDCs is not so widespread. That's why they're lingering at that below 1% share in world trade. So the proposal is very simple. If you incorporate in any of your products, in any of your exports, ingredients and value added from LDC, any export from any WTO member to any other WTO member will receive a proportionate reduction in the MFN tariffs that is directly proportional to the value of LDC ingredients that that product contains. So, as I said, Nespresso capsules, for instance, if they face the double-digit tariffs, they may be made in Switzerland, but if they are exported to India or if they are exported to Indonesia or to the United States, if they are incorporating coffee beans from LDCs, the value of these coffee beans will not be dutiable. And that will create multiple advantages. First of all, we'll create a price premium for LDC products. All the producers in the world would have a direct commercial incentive to source products from LDCs. And given that the LDCs have a very small share, and this is going to be a huge boost to global demand, there will be a strong price increase for the benefit of LDCs. So LDCs do not necessarily need to produce more in order to gain more. So that's the first immediate direct impact of allowing this duty-free, quota-free sort of treatment along the supply chains, not only for the direct exports. It's also a potential benefit if LDCs are ready to move to the next stage of the production. They may have some cost disadvantages, but imagine you're a producer and you source coffee beans or fruits, mangoes, whatever from an LDC. If the conditions allow, and now you have a double-digit incentive, this tariff savings you can make if you place more production in LDCs, maybe you can offset this cost disadvantage and you will increase the value added in LDCs. And in a paper that I recently published with my co-author, we used a very sophisticated CG model, and we quantified this type of effects. They are potentially there for them to be materialized. And we see that for LDCs, these kind of benefits will go to the tune of an increase of their exports by an average of 2%. So this annual increase in their exports will put them on a growth path, which eventually will lead to the achievement of this UN SDG of LDC participating in global supply chains. They would also be able to diversify, and this will really create the kind of necessary revenues for poor communities who will be faced with this additional cost from climate change. There will be additional costs for very poor people to adapt and to mitigate the perhaps unforeseen circumstances of climate change. So we will have a double gain here. We would allow these producers in least developed countries to integrate in trade, and we know already from the literature that being part of supply chains gives you a wage premium, gives you an ability to expand and diversify. And with this additional income, they can perhaps invest in infrastructure, education, or climate adaptation measures. So there is clear potential. The other interesting feature of this initiative is that it's not at the expense of any other WTO member, because LDCs only benefit if exports of other countries will grow, and it's through these exports that LDC inputs will be facilitated. Every single other country stands to gain. And our simulations indicate that this is, for any of the countries we have in our model, there is no decrease in welfare. Every country will have either a positive increase, allegedly small one, but this is not at the expense of anyone else. It's only for the benefit of LDCs and for the long-standing commitment from the international community to help the most disadvantaged countries in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucien. I thought I was about to have to interrupt you, but not at all. So thank you very much for your presentation and for reminding us that least developed countries face some of the biggest challenges for coming up with a trade policy suggestion that's so clear and for having been able to quantify it. One thing I've seen, having been around in this field for 25 years now, is that by starting to introduce ideas and to talk about them, and if we go banging on about them enough, then they can come into fruition. And we all know mode 5, thanks to you starting to introduce this, Lucian. So I think you've got an excellent suggestion. Let's keep talking about it. We now turn to the fourth and final speaker, is Maria Teresa Pisani from the UN Economic Commission for Europe. Maria Teresa, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit, if you can, about international organizations and how they can be developing concrete sustainability-oriented tools so that governments, businesses, and consumers can use them to advance the climate agenda. I know you've been working on these, and I'd love for you to share with us what you've been doing and another fourth message of hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Teresa. First of all, for the very inspiring opening of our meeting today, a meeting of hope. And thank you to IISD for organizing the session. A pleasure to be with you all today. And as Teresa mentioned, the focus of my intervention is going to be on practical solutions that can support the sustainability and climate agenda, and then can bring together all the main actors around the table, policymakers, industry players, NGOs, and academia, in one of the most resource-intensive sector, that is the garment and footwear industry. So a very practical focus, I would say here. On the next slide, please. I'm going to highlight that, in fact, textile consumption is one is the fourth highest pressure category in the EU in terms of use of primary raw materials and water, after food, housing, and transport. And this is the fifth one for greenhouse gas emissions, according to the European Environmental Agency. It also represents at global level 4% of the global emissions alone. And based on estimate growth trends, the sector will actually need to cut its emission in half in order to stay on the 1.5 degrees path. Most of the emissions, also interestingly, are happening in the upstream part of the value chain. So basically at the farming, at the raw material production and processing level. And these kind of impacts are the most difficult to track, and actually greater transparency and traceability of the value chain are here key enablers in measuring impacts and risks, including emissions, and to reduce them. Now, not only the sector, of course, bears a great deal of impacts on the environment, but also on labor and social rights. It's actually a sector that features global fragmented value chains. Most of the actors are SMEs. In the EU, 90% are SMEs. And most of the workers employed in this industry are women and girls that in many countries earn less than a living wage and have irregular contracts. So a big deal of impacts at the environmental and social human rights side. And since you can basically improve what you know and you can measure, if we can go to the next, please. Traceability and transparency are becoming prominent aspects on the sustainability, circularity and climate agenda for this particular industry. And here I want to flag a few drivers according to our research and analysis that are actually emphasizing and stressing the importance of moving on traceability and transparency. First is consumers. Even during the COVID pandemic, research and reports have showed that consumers are increasingly willing to go for more responsible choices and are paying attention more and more to the sustainability performance of what they buy, the products they buy, the clothing they buy. The problem is that it's very hard for them to know and to get information on the how, where, by whom their clothing are made, and there is very little trust on what is declared on the claims made on the labels of the clothing they buy. Second, in terms of industry, investors, and regulators, they are also, I would say, civil society, investors, regulators are also paying increasing attention on the reliability of claims on products. And there is an increasing body of policy and regulation that is looking at due diligence, sustainability, and reliability of claims for products in this particular sector. The EU is coming up with a due diligence directive, with a new non-financial reporting directive, a EU textile strategy, digital environmental product passports, and these are all regulatory efforts that are putting an emphasis on the need to enhance the traceability and transparency of the value chain as an important precondition there to enable more responsible consumption and production choices. And the industry itself is increasingly paying attention, because due diligence means that you have to take care of sustainability performance not only at your industry, at your factory premises. You are responsible and more and accountable for sustainability performance of your suppliers, and you have to look and manage risk along the entire value chain. And as most of the impacts, as I was mentioning, are happening upstream in the value chain, you have to look far away from actually the downstream part of the value chain, especially in this industry. Now, there is also interesting developments in terms of innovation and advanced technologies, and it's important to look also at this dimension, because blockchain, artificial intelligence, digital physical markers are there promising to support getting more visibility around what's happening along the value chain. Therefore, it's very important that the three levels are addressed together. First of all, the policy level, so measures that can actually help governments, policymakers to devise the right actions in support of the industry, and for the industry to take this journey. It's very important to work at the standards level to make sure that actors along the value chain speak the same language, and there is a common framework for the collection and exchange of data, documents, evidence in support of traceability and transparency. And then this third layer, which is the technology layer, and the importance of considering and looking at the role that advanced technologies can play here. The next, please. Now, as part, yes, perhaps on the next slide. Now, as part of the, so at UNEC, at the Economic Commission for Europe of the United Nations, we have been working on an initiative that we started 3 years ago, together with the European Commission, the International Trade Center, and many other UN agencies and players, and is an initiative that has involved a large number of experts from the industry, companies, business associations. It has been a truly, let's say, public-private partnership to come up with this toolbox. So we have been not only developing policy recommendations and the standard, but we have actually piloting this toolbox in a blockchain environment, and together with industry partners, because it's important also to say, okay, policy regulation needs to be there, standards need to be there, but then they need to be of use and of benefit to the users. So from the very start, the idea here has been to engage with the industry, with the recipients, with the beneficiaries, to make sure that this was of use to them, and it was a framework that could really support them in doing this traceability and transparency of the value chain. So as part of the project, we have developed a blockchain system that we are now piloting for the cotton, for the leather value chain, with brands, with manufacturers, with raw material producers and providers, and with tax solution providers. I just want to go on the next one to show you a concrete example of products that we have been targeting as part of this pilot with Vivian Fast Food and its value chain. We have been testing traceability and transparency of claims related to origin and organic content for a pair of for a shirt, traceability of origin, recycled content, and chemical compliance for a pair of jeans. And on the next slide, you can see how the application of our approach is allowing basically the mapping of all the value chain players, the identification of all the data and information and supporting documents that need to be exchanged among value chain actors for the traceable assets that have been identified here. So for an organic t-shirt in the blockchain environment, we could map the origin of all the various processes and value chain stages, and then the collection of the data, certificates, documents that support that traceability and the claim that was made on origin organic content. On the next one is just showcasing the case of the recycled denim and the traceability of all the actors and the evidence on compliance with sustainability standards for these actors along the value chain. And then to conclude, as part of the initiative, we on the next slide, we have also launched a call to action, basically to call on the industry to make pledges on the implementation of the toolbox, the standard that we have developed as part of the project. Since June this year, we have more than 124 partners that have engaged on the pledge and have made specific commitments on specific actions to improve the traceability and transparency of the value chain. And finally, just some concluding remarks, and thank you very much for the time. On the final slide, a recap on why traceability is important. It allows the tracking of products back to raw material extraction and processing. Very important, as more of the environmental climate impacts are actually there. Enables manufacturers to create product digital and physical twins, benefit market surveillance and customs authorities. It makes reliable information available to policymakers, links incentives to sustainability performance, and finally allows citizens to have access to relevant and verified product information, which is very key actually if we want to make sure that we have reliable and verified claims on sustainability performance for what we buy. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria Teresa, for your detailed and precise intervention. I found it fascinating to learn exactly what detailed and precise work is being done in this area by a variety of stakeholders, from industry to government to consumers, and especially the use of now how blockchain can be piloted. So thank you very much for that very succinct intervention of obviously an expose of it. There's a lot more work that's going on behind that, but thank you for introducing it. Before we open the floor, I'd like to turn back to our first speaker, who didn't quite use up all of her time, and who I wanted to ask her about the ACCTS, which is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. Now, that's, for those of you who think that's a new acronym, it's not yet in agreement. That's something that's being discussed, and she's going to tell us about what the prospects must be, and also to mention about the co-sponsors on the platform for trade and climate agenda. Anna, you again have the floor.
Thank you, Teresa, and I apologize because yes, I did miss addressing the question on the ACCTS. The ACCTS is an agreement that is under negotiation currently, and it's led by New Zealand, Costa Rica, Switzerland, Fiji, Iceland, and Norway. This is a very forward-looking negotiation, a very forward-looking agreement, because it tries to view environmental goods and services through a more holistic approach that goes beyond tariff liberalization, and rather aims to bring together some of the interrelated elements of climate change, trade, and sustainable development agendas in a coherent manner. This is indeed an opportunity as a benchmark when it finalizes the negotiations, because it provides sectoral cooperation, definitely, and it addresses, as I mentioned, trade policy, and also the rules and architecture necessary to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and also facilitate increased trade and contribute to sustainable development. So for Costa Rica, this is a good opportunity to have the trade and climate policy agendas come together and make a substantial contribution with aligned objectives. As I mentioned, this could be a very interesting benchmark or model to look after when it's done, the negotiations are done, because of how holistic and innovative it is. And then I would like to address Maria Teresa's question on the role of co-sponsors at the TESSD. And this is very relevant and very timely, because we are, as I said at the very beginning, still in the process of doing outreach and bringing more co-sponsors to the table. What is the role of a co-sponsor in the TESSD? Well, as a co-sponsor member, members have the opportunity to build the agenda, to construct the program, the work program that will be launched February of 2022. We, in the statement, have presented not a tentative, but a draft work program of meetings, but we want the members to provide us with the feedback, with the input of the topics of interest. What is most relevant? What is the priority for the members, the co-sponsors, to be discussed, and to bring together this trade and environment agendas together for the discussion. Although TESSD is an open platform, any member can join our meetings. The co-sponsors are the ones leading the way. The co-sponsors are the ones with the voice to put the program, the agenda together. So we believe it's fundamental to have as many voices as possible, to have a very inclusive, although broad, but inclusive work program that can help us also guide the discussions and try to bring the broadest amount of members possible. The other day, I heard a colleague from another mission say something that was, very, it was very candid. And he said that if you are not on the table, you are part of the menu. So that is why we believe that as many co-sponsors as possible in this table will help us have a very broad agenda of topics, but not only the broad number, it's the quality of the topics that we want to address. So I think that with that, I covered what I was missing. Thank you very much again, Teresa.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna, for having taken up that. We can open the floor and we can take raised hands, or you can put questions in the chat. Within the chat already, there was a precise question to Clara. Clara, just nod if you've already seen that. It relates to the enforceability of the provisions within PTAs. I don't know if you would like to take that question, whether you saw it, whether you, yeah, is that okay? Okay, Clara, you again have the floor.
Yes, many thanks for a great question, because of course, it's wonderful to see all these environmental provisions, including climate-related ones, in PTAs. On the other hand, of course, seeing them on paper doesn't mean they're implemented and they are enforced and they actually make a difference on the ground. It is promising to see that a number of studies actually hint at the fact that yes, these provisions do make a difference. They do make a difference. They do make a difference in terms of regulatory activities, legislative activities by states that have these provisions in their PTAs, and they also seem to have an impact on environmental quality. That doesn't mean that enforcement always works well and implementation always works well. So it's a very relevant question. You're asking specifically about the European approach. And it's true that there are two different models out there, the US approach and the EU approach to enforcement that differ quite a lot. The EU is working more with a sanctions-based enforcement approach, while the EU is taking a more cooperative approach that seems to be softer, but also seems to be working well in many instances. So a softer approach based on dialogue, on involving civil society, on setting up committees, and thereby driving change. So while some see this as a promising way to enforce provisions and to implement provisions by actually involving civil society and other stakeholders, there is a debate currently about the effectiveness of the EU approach to enforcement. And so this is a debate that's ongoing, and many argue that the EU approach might be too weak and should be reformed. And we'll have to see what comes out of this discussion. So I guess my overall message is mixed. Yes, implementation enforcement is key. There is potential to improve this for sure, depending on country context and partners. But we do have a lot of evidence and studies that show that these environmental provisions are actually able to drive change and make a difference on the ground. So far from my side.
Okay. Thank you, Clara. I think I'm going to stick with Clara because there's another question specifically to you from Professor Maria Claire Cordonnier-Segar, who, I don't know if you managed to see that question, but it's eventually talking about best practice within, it's the penultimate question. Yeah, best practice for trade measures in IEAs. So would you like to also take that question?
I'm happy to do so. I have to take a look at the question.
Okay, there's another question.
I could say it if it's more helpful. I know you invited us to actually speak. I'm happy to do that instead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we were meant to do that, but
what I really was hoping that Clara could just clarify. I mean, obviously, I've done a fair bit of work on this, and there's quite a few that I've been looking at. And I was wondering if she could just give maybe the top two in either of the two categories that she mentioned, the trade measures that have, well, the trade agreements that have climate measures, and then also the IEAs that use trade and investment measures. I've got my own views on which ones have some of the most innovative provisions, but I'd love to hear hers from the work she's doing.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Claire.
Okay, many thanks. Yeah, so I'm not sure what you're after, and I'm happy to hear more about your research and your take on the most innovative approaches. I think when it comes to the PTA with the highest number of environmental provisions, it's the more recent agreements, and one example that sticks out is the TPP-11. That does include, I think, more than 100 environmental provisions. It doesn't mean that they're all innovative. So innovation is another dimension that we have to look at. And so I would be curious to also hear your take on this. When it comes to IEAs, I'm not sure which one is the most innovative IEA or the one with the the highest number of trade-related provisions. But of course, some of the most well-known trade provisions in environmental agreements are the trade-related measures in the Montreal Protocol, right? To address, to protect the ozone layer better, and they seem to have been very successful in increasing membership to this environmental agreement, and thus making the agreement more effective, and actually contributing to the big success of the Montreal Protocol in protecting the ozone layer. That's one of the more well-known examples, but it's interesting to look at this big database that we work with that includes more than 2,000 IEAs, and many less well-known examples and to really understand better what kind of provisions are in there, what kind of effects might they have on trade flows, but also then eventually on the environmental dimension of these agreements. And if you look at the sectoral questions, actually many of the IEAs that do include trade provisions concern fisheries. So you can also look at them by sector and find out which sectors are most prone to actually making use of these trade measures. And well, of course, the hope is that there's space for mutually beneficial interlinkages between trade and climate, or trade and the environment more generally, and to include provisions that promote trade flows in a way that can also help protect the environment. Happy to exchange more also bilaterally.
Brilliant.
Okay, thank you, Clara.
You've surprised
thank
me.
you.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Claire. So we had a question earlier, which was about livelihoods. I'm not sure whether anyone on the panel would like to take this. I'll give you a moment in case you would. And there's also a question from Mahesh, who I think would be really addressed to Lucien about the specificities of his proposal to supporting LDCs related to certification across the supply chains. So Lucien, I don't know if you want to read that question, or if anyone else would like to take the question on livelihoods, which is actually quite a difficult one.
So do you want me to go ahead on the second question and we leave more time for all of us to reflect on the other question? All right, very good. So that's a very, very pertinent question, and I'm glad that I could elaborate a bit more on the practicalities of this initiative. So as I tried to explain, already in the existing schemes for LDC exporters to benefit from duty-free, quota-free, there are certain procedures in place, including providing certification and documentation. So the good news is that, at least for the one I know best in the European Union, that everything but arms, the rate of utilization, so the extent to which LDC exporters really do make use of this scheme is impressive. It's over 90% on all across LDC product sector. So on average, it's very well used, which means that at the very first stage of production, LDCs are already capable to comply with the immediate requirements for them to participate in the supply chain. So now what would be necessary, if we stick to the coffee bean example, or to the mango fruit, the mango flavor yogurt, another example I wanted to give. If you have to export now mango flavored yogurt or capsules, coffee capsules, the exporter would need to just keep this existing certificate. So there is no need for an additional red tape paperwork. We will extend the value and the administrative costs that LDCs have already incurred. They will actually give them bigger benefits, and they will be passed on to the next supplier, to the next custom official, and so on and so forth. So really, the existing rules in place and the existing documentation will make it sustainable. Now there is, and I'm glad that I see Maria Teresa's colleagues so eagerly advancing on blockchain, because of course digitalization and blockchain would really reduce the carbon footprint and the cost of complying with such things. And then there's a third example which I wanted to use, also from blockchain cocoa producers and some small farmers. There is, for instance, I come across one very interesting example where a blockchain solution was put in place for small farmers, I think in Africa, in Ghana, if I'm not wrong, really small farmers with just a few hectares. They are given handheld devices, they can scan a barcode, and then they can issue an organic certificate. Imagine the same technology would be used now by throughout the supply chain by all the chocolate producers. They could say, look, this is made out of organic cocoa beans, and it will be digitalized. So small farmers do not, thanks to technology, they are not necessarily penalized if we put in place these new initiatives, because with the money that they save on tariffs, we could deploy such provisions. We could also guarantee, if we're interested in this additional certification, organic, or now in the EU would have this new initiative on deforestation. So if you want to prove to the rest of the world that your cocoa beans are not produced on what used to be yesterday a bunch of forest. You would have now the ability to certify yourself with a low cost if you deploy this digital solution. And to offset for the initial cost of this investment, I think the tariff savings that the initiative would provide for, which are non-negligible by any metrics, will give the buy-in of the corporations and the small farmers to work together. It's also good for corporate social responsibility to say that you work with small farmers to protect the Amazonian forest, and not only saying it. Now you would have the means to prove it with a irrefutable proof. I mean, blockchain, you can't forge it. And in the process, we will generate additional revenues for small farmers in poor countries.
Okay. Thank you, Lucian. It's incredible how the technology is enabling much easier certification, and we just have to see it used more widely. I'm turning now to Maria Teresa. I see that you have something to add. Can you just be very careful on your headset and speak clearly?
Yes. Can you hear me well, Teresa? Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Seems something doesn't work really well.
Yes, I think we can hear you. I think if you can maybe not move backwards and forwards too much, we'll hear you more consistently.
Okay. Now, just to add on one of the questions that was in the chat from Jürgen, and this is about the EU Mercosur and the chapter in the agreement that relates to compliance with the Paris Pact. And what also Clara was mentioning in terms of the EU approach on implementation of these environmental provisions in preferential trade agreements, we are going to be part of a series of meetings with Brazilian leather producers, actually led by the European Commission, to discuss with them about practical tools and solutions they can use to track compliance with the provisions related to deforestation. Because basically what's happening is that leather producers now in Europe, or leather goods producers in Europe, need to prove that the leather is coming from farms that are not contributing to deforestation. And therefore, this is going to be a challenge, for producers of leather outside from the EU when it comes to prove such a compliance. So the idea here is to build capacity and to demonstrate what solutions are out there that can practically help leather producers to demonstrate compliance with such requirements. And I agree with Lucien that blockchain technology can be an opportunity also for very small farmers and small producers actually to get more market access and prove that compliance. We are working with the small cotton producers from Latin America, and they are joining the blockchain system and easily providing that evidence that is requested now downstream the value chain in a blockchain environment. So that can be an important enabler, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria Teresa, and we heard you perfectly. I think it's almost time to wrap up and to go back through the panelists with, I will be going through in semi-reverse order. So I would go Lucian, Maria Teresa, Clara, and then Anna, with one closing thought each. But before I do that, I will just share a very small personal anecdote. I told you at the beginning this was going to be an optimistic panel, and I think we all need lots of optimism. When the WTO was formed 25 years ago, it was almost taboo to talk about trade and environment. It was very much a niche area, and to talk about what impact trade had on the environment really was almost taboo. And now it's become mainstream to the extent that we have a whole conference on this. Another personal anecdote is one of my children loves cars, and we used to go to see the Geneva Car Show, which is just a few minutes from my house. And it always struck me how much energy and ingenuity went into thinking about how to make these cars go faster or more dynamic or whatever. And would lament what a pity such brain power couldn't be put to addressing some more of the world's more pertinent questions. And I think that's something that in the 25 years has really changed. We have such a lot of thoughts and brains thinking about these issues and these links. So with that thought, which was meant to be an anecdote at the beginning, but I didn't want to take too much time then. With that thought, I'd like to go back through the panel. Like, what are your optimistic takeaways from the work that you've been doing, the brain power that's there in your organization, the people you associate with, can we take away on this issue of mitigating climate change, reducing inequality, and so on? So if I turn Lucian first, and then Maria, and then Clara, then Anna.
Thank you, Teresa. I don't have any immediate anecdotes to share, but I do share your enthusiasm for the topic and the excellent sort of way forward that our panelists have put together from so many different angles. I would like to bring to our attention perhaps one area that is part of my current job description, and that's new technologies. I think what we see, and I'm very much encouraged by these new disruptive technologies that will really make climate change less costly. It will make it more affordable even for developing countries who are in a position to leapfrog in this area. So, well, blockchain is one, just one idea, digitalization, but also the way in which we can promote this transfer of technology through trade. Trade allows for cleaner products to be traded worldwide, to be affordable to those countries who would need to invest in their own infrastructure. Countries that are at different levels of development, they need to develop. That's obviously, it goes without saying that the economic activity will continue and needs to put new elements in place. But if we make these new elements, this new infrastructure, these new technologies available to everyone, then I think that's one of the most important drivers for trade as a driver for common shared prosperity to also support climate change. We have here an opportunity to promote clean technologies that not everyone can produce, but if we were to expand our ability to share them and to benefit from these breakthrough innovations in different parts of the world, that would be really a public good for everyone to enjoy.
Thank you, Lucian. Countries can leapfrog, and we have the opportunity to promote clean technologies. Maria Teresa, to you, for what are your two takeaways for messages? What would you like to be the takeaway messages for our audience today?
Basically sharing that from the experience of the work on the project I'm leading since the last few years, I think a lot of solutions are out there that can be scaled up and that can really support to accelerate action in the right direction. It takes the courage, leadership, and partnership. I would say that partnership, collaboration of value chain actors, building trust to make them, working together is a fundamental ingredient. And technology can help also in that direction, can help to create that enabling environment that make the connection between all these actors, and they can help to enhance the trust, to establish the partnership that needs to be there. So that's my concluding message, and it's a message of hope, definitely.
Thank you so much, Maria Teresa. Please, everyone, take that away. A lot of solutions are out there. We need courage, leadership, and partnership to make those connections. Turning to you, Clara, what's your key takeaway for everyone today?
Yes, many things. I think it's highly relevant to work more closely and work on the intersections between trade and climate to really make sure we find solutions that help accelerate the speed of tackling the challenge we're facing. I think we're on a really good track. I think overall, I'm optimistic that there's a consensus that we will have a climate neutral, a carbon neutral global economy within just a few decades. But to make this happen, we need to really mobilize, not only national action, but also international action, and make use of all the entry points I outlined at the multilateral level, at the plurilateral level, but also at the regional and bilateral level, and make it happen. So I think we're on the right track, but we need to speed up our efforts because the time is clicking, the clock is ticking, and we're running out of time to tackle the climate crisis in time.
Thank you, Clara. I like the message. We're on a really good track to a carbon neutral economy within a few decades, but let's speed up. So no resting on our laurels. And Anna Laura, I turn to you for your closing thoughts for our audience and takeaway messages.
Thank you again, Teresa. And I also want to close on a positive and optimistic note. In particular, because through the trade lens, seeing how we can offer part of the solution is fundamental. I think that also countries need to have a bottom-up view. Not only the multilateral trading system can give all the solutions. At the domestic level, we also need to look into the governance in the creation and implementation of our public policies. And we need also to have an encouragement for a green transition, for also access to green financing, and the multilateral trading system can help through green aid for trade, for example, which is very important in the line of adapting to climate shocks. We also need this kind of support, but we need to stop the rhetoric and go to the actions. So members, countries have that possibility. And as I said at the very beginning, there are a lot of solutions coming from the developing world that need to be encouraged, that need to be portrayed, that need to be communicated, because everyone can learn from this. So I hope that we can, in the trade community, start to really go into the actions and stop with the rhetoric. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Anna. So green finance, green aid for trade, and more action. So now I have exactly a minute or two to wrap up this panel before the organizers cut us off, ready for the next panel. So I would just like to, first of all, thank the organizers, the IISD, for organizing this whole hub and for making every effort to make sure that everyone who wanted to participate could do so. I'd like to thank my co-panel organizers, specifically Clara and the ECE. Thank you very much for this collaboration. To the audience, thank you for joining. Thank you for having stayed this long. And I wish you all a very pleasant end to the day and a prosperous new year. Thank you to everyone.